Well, hello and welcome to episode 104 of the Plain Accounts podcast series, where every week we get together and discuss the upcoming gospel lection for preaching resources this coming Sunday. Today I'm joined again by Dr. Richard Thompson. He is the professor of New Testament at NNU, and he also chairs the philosophy and religion department there at NNU as well. Dr. Thompson, thank you so much for joining me.
Oh, it's always great to be with you, Ben.
Can you tell our audience a little bit about what your day-to-day kind of entails in your role?
Well, in the last year, we've been going through accreditation type of work for the Association of Theological Schools. So I actually was involved doing the gathering of the materials for the self-study, which was pretty scary.
Oh, wow.
But we went through successful accreditation visits. So last year was involved in a lot of that. But I teach in both the master's level and undergraduate programs, and but then oversee the undergraduate programs as well.
Oh, wow. And you also have a couple of commentaries published, correct?
I have one commentary, in the book of Acts, and then I've either written or edited 6 other books as well.
Oh, wonderful. Well, again, it's just a pleasure to have you on board, and I always enjoy our conversations, and I hope our listeners will benefit from it as well.
Yeah, we're looking forward to it.
Yeah. Well, let's look at Mark 6, verses 1 through 13, and I'm going to read that before we dive in from the NIV this morning. But those of you who have not yet had a chance to go read the commentaries on the website, we have some incredible commentaries this week, as always, and we hope that they are a help to you. Engage in the conversation. There's comments below, and also on our Facebook page. There's always a conversation happening, and we'd love any feedback you might have about the site. Let me begin to read Mark chapter 6, verses 1 through 13. Jesus left there and went to his homeland, accompanied by his disciples. When the Sabbath came, he began to teach in the synagogue, and many who heard him were amazed. "Where did this man get these things?" they asked. "What's this wisdom that has been given him? What are these remarkable miracles he is performing? Isn't this the carpenter? Isn't this Mary's son and the brother of James, Joseph, Judas, and Simon? Aren't his sisters here with us?" And they took offense at him. Jesus said to them, "A prophet is not without honor except in his own hometown, among his relatives, and in his own home." He could not do any miracles there except lay his hands on a few sick people and heal them. He was amazed at their lack of faith. Then Jesus went around teaching from the village to village, calling the 12 to him. He began to send them out 2 by 2 and gave them authority over impure spirits. These were his instructions: "Take nothing for the journey except a staff, no bread, no bag, no money in your belts. Wear sandals, but not an extra shirt. Whenever you enter a house, stay there until you leave that town. And if any place will not welcome you or listen to you, leave that place and shake the dust off your feet as a testimony against them." They went out and preached that people should repent. They drove out many demons and anointed many sick people with oil and healed them. This is the written word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
Thanks be to God. Wow, a lot is happening in this passage. These 13 verses kind of really clip along, but there's quite a bit that's happening here. One thing that stuck out to me in the first few verses was that Jesus was amazed, and oftentimes we would define amazement as a good thing, a positive state, but it seems as though the people were amazed by his teaching in a negative way.
Yeah, it's and that's different than, for instance, when Luke tells a similar story, which is placed at the beginning of Jesus' ministry. Here, Mark has it in the middle of Jesus' ministry. The people were amazed in in Luke's version, and people were were talking about Jesus' gracious words and things like that. Here the account is rather is rather different, right? So and so instead they're saying where did he get all this, and so they're talking about things like where did this wisdom come from, and and things like that. So so you have a rather negative kind of response on their part. So they're not they're not responding in a positive way at all to to what he has to say.
And the basis of this rejection doesn't seem to be what he's saying, because they acknowledge it as wisdom. They seem to acknowledge the quality of his teaching, but the basis of their rejection of him seems to be something else. What would that be?
Yeah. Well, and Mark doesn't come right out and say it, but notice there in the passage, he says, what deeds of power are being done by his hands? But then, is this the carpenter? Isn't this the carpenter? Isn't this Mary's son? And so he starts talking about about the family. So it starts instantly going in that kind of direction. So it could be one of two things in that respect. There are some that suggest that this is reflecting ongoing questions about his birth. That these are hints in Mark's gospel about since you don't have in Mark's gospel anything about about the miraculous birth or anything like that, that these are reflecting some of the doubts that would have surrounded surrounded that. I'm not sure that it's really that, in that respect. I think probably what we have is that, here is the fact that it's talking about Mary's son rather than Joseph's son. And so probably the fact that it's showing that, that here is Mary, who's probably widowed. Jesus is more than likely the oldest son. And yet here he's gone off into this itinerant ministry, and yet as the oldest son, he should have been taking care of his mother. And so in that in that culture, he should have been the one who had been taking care of his mother. And so given all of that, they would have seen him as shirking his responsibility. And so Mark's not going to go into all of that, right? But that's the reason why they would take offense at him, because here he's giving them, in essence, you're telling us all these fine things, but you're not doing the kinds of things that you should be doing. And so, so there's kind of this, this sense of, why should we listen to you when you don't follow through and do the things that you should be doing?
And is that the same way that we should see carpentry as well? Was carpentry viewed as like a negative profession, or is it just kind of saying, you're teaching us as a rabbi, aren't you a carpenter? Like, you need to go do carpentry things. It could be that. There were some who viewed carpentry kind of in a negative kind of way, that this is a trade and and the like, and so so you're not particularly qualified in that respect. And and yet, if we look in other places in the New Testament, you have, for instance, Paul, who had a trade, and there's no sign of, of that being a negative, per se. So, so some people have gone that direction,
and push that in terms of well, he's just a carpenter. He works with his hands, but that wasn't the case, with let's say Paul. So
Right.
so that may be overstated, in the end. So it may have been more of the social obligations, and the fact that here was Jesus who didn't stick around, perhaps, and take care of family obligations, left it to other family members. And that's where, in that respect, sometimes itinerant kinds of ministers or philosophers had some some questionable kinds of reputations in that respect, with regard to family.
Interesting.
Yeah.
And you get a whole kind of litany of his family members that are present there, and they speak about his brothers and sisters, which is not a real highlight in other gospels. It's very rare to hear about the rest of his siblings, and it seems out of that amazement of their lack of faith at the beginning, it's kind of bookended, at least until verse 5, when he seems to say, out of that amazement, that a prophet is without honor in his own town. And because of that, is it because of the rigid faith that he's unable to perform miracles? Is that what we're supposed to draw from this?
Yeah, it seems to be. That's an interesting expression that only Mark has. Where it says that Jesus, and the Greek is that Jesus could not do, or he was unable to do, many deeds of power there. Although it then says, except that he did a few things. But it's interesting that the Greek expression is that he could not do, which is something that we just don't think of Jesus in that way.
Right.
We don't think of Jesus as being unable to do anything. And yet the Greek wording says precisely that Jesus was unable to. Now he qualifies it and says, except that he laid his hands on a few sick people and cured them. So he obviously did a few things, but it is connected to what he's so astonished about. And that is that that they don't believe, and it's not just they don't believe, they have this disbelief. There's this rigid sense of this refusal to believe at that point. It's almost like it doesn't matter what he says. They simply will not believe. And so they're blinded, to the divine work that's being done through him.
Wow. And I think that's a perfect segue to talk about that theme of blindness and seeing that we get a lot in Mark. But before we jump to that, I think it's such a stark contrast of what we preached on last Sunday, which was the woman with the issue of blood. Whereas, I think our definition of control really needs to be tweaked in regards to Christ, because here he's unable, as the Greek would say, to perform miracles. And in the crowd, when they're pressing against him, he was surprised by the power of God moving through him. And we would say, wouldn't he have control over what he chooses to do with the power of God and what he doesn't choose to do? Wouldn't he be the whole agent of that power of God? And I guess it begs the question: is it our perspective of control and authority that needs to maybe shift a little bit according to Mark's Jesus on how we see his control or abilities with God's power?
Yeah. But it's you're right that there's this this interesting kind of contrast between the Nazarenes here in chapter 6 and the woman who's considered unclean by Jewish standards in chapter 5. who insist that, if only she can, she can touch him, if she can only touch, the very fringe, which is interesting. And I owe this to my colleague, former colleague and teacher, George Lyons, that, as he put it, it's, she's wanting to touch the very fringe, which is suggesting that, that Jesus, probably, or that's a reference, to Jesus, the fringes of Jesus' clothes, probably, reflecting, what Orthodox Jews would have on their fringes. And that is, where they would have the tassels, with the Shema, on the very fringes, at least, in more Pharisaic traditions, that's what they had there, and so that would suggest that probably even Jesus leaned in that direction, in terms of his garb and in his own lifestyle, and here is the woman who, in that sense, was touching the most sacred part of Jesus, so to speak. And reaching out, but also, the ultimate act of faith in that respect, because the Shema was the faith of Israel. And so, so here is this act of faith, not in terms of simply, God, do what I want, but this simply reaching out to God.
Wow.
Versus now here are, the hometown folk, who are in essence doing the very opposite, who are really, pushing Jesus away. And so instead of reaching out in faith, there is this rigid opposite of faith, and notice it's in the synagogue of all places.
Right. The center where they believe God to be.
And, and so of all places where you would expect faith to be vibrant and alive and, and being embodied, it would be there. And yet it's, and so of course Jesus is amazed, because here is where faith should be, expressed.
Wow.
And yet instead what he finds is, it's not.
Oh my goodness. That really puts it into perspective. I hadn't made that link between the lack of faith and where they were. Like, they were in the place of worship. And if anywhere should have robust faith, it should be there. So is it this dynamic then that leads him to say what he does to his disciples? I had never connected these two events before, even though they're back to back in Mark, that he essentially tells his disciples, look, if they treat you the way my hometown is treating me right now, shake the dust off your feet as a testimony to them, and move along. Could you unpack that a little bit of what maybe Jesus is saying to his disciples there?
I think that, it's interesting that usually, in fact, I see that in most cases, commentators don't make the connection between 1 through 6 and 7 through, through 13, in all practical purposes, other than one happened after the other.
Okay.
But I think, what you're saying is exactly right, that there is this kind of thematic connection, that there is this sense of faith, this sense of trust that is a part of this whole unit, because often when people interpret this second part, there's almost this kind of judgment that is seen in terms of shaking the dust off your feet, and almost a kind of hostile act.
Yeah.
But it really isn't a hostile act at all. It's more of a sense of, if there is this sense of disbelief that you encounter, you've done your part, you have attempted to share, but notice that with that there is that disbelief is shown in terms of lack of hospitality.
Mm-hmm.
And if that's the case, you don't fight it, you move on. And with that, you leave everything behind.
Mm-hmm.
You don't take anything with you. You don't even take a speck of dust with you. And so by shaking the dust off your feet, it can be seen as defiance, but this is more of a sense in which you are going to so trust God, that you take absolutely nothing with you. And so you move on, and you take, you don't even take, the speck of dust that sticks to your feet. You leave that, with them as well, if they do not care for your needs.
Would the dust on the feet as well be a sign of that lack of hospitality? Because one of the general forms of welcoming was washing feet, and so their feet would be dusty with no reception. So
that's true.
They would then shake that off and say, well, we will leave this. We're not going to even hold on to that, disrespect or lack of reception or hospitality. We'll leave that here with you, and we'll continue to move on, and maybe so where there is trust, grow in that sort of. I love that connection you just made, because even with when I read this, I didn't even think about the connection between hospitality and the growth of faith within a community. And it would be so stark here.
Yeah, but I hadn't thought about the washing of the feet, but I think when you add that in as a possibility, it's not in the text here, but I think that that if that is a hospitable act, and that isn't done, it's like, even that which you didn't do, I'm going to wash that off and leave that. But it's done in an opposite kind of way, to leave even that which I brought with me into town.
Right.
I'm going to leave that as well. Would be an incredible act that says something prophetic. It's like the turning of the other cheek.
Right.
That is that reveals it's not simply a kind of passive act, but it also reveals what is wrong in what has been done. And so in that respect, almost this, by this counter washing, one would expose their lack of hospitality.
Yeah. Gosh, that's such a powerful juxtaposition there. Even as I think about this, I'm wondering, as a pastor, how I can help engage my congregation's imagination in what's happening here. Because as you've mentioned, even before we went on live, there's been the disciples on the Sea of Galilee, and they see Jesus calm the wind and the waves, and yet they ask, "Who is this?" And then we have the woman who is hemorrhaging touch the hem of the garment, and they witness this healing through her, and there's still this act of questioning Jesus' identity even into Mark chapter 6 after these incredible things that have happened. And so there seems to be a disconnect between seeing and believing, that there's no real direct correlation between the two in Mark. And so maybe our question as pastors is, how do we help our congregations see the truth of what's happening here? And maybe you could help us understand that theme of seeing and faith a bit more in Mark's gospel in general?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah, yeah. In Mark seems to use different words for seeing, in relation to faith. So that there are words that talk about seeing with the eyes, and so so what's interesting here is that we have a positive image of the disciples and how they respond, and so we find later they come back and they report what happens and things are positive, which is rather interesting, because this is rather unusual for Mark's depiction of the disciples, because it kind of goes downhill from here for the disciples, because typically they are those who, they're like the rocky soil. But this is one of the good images where it flourishes for a while, and then will later start to wither. But this is a part where it looks like good soil, and and so this is a scene where it is, so initially seeing can bring some positive, seeing with the eyes, but not necessarily getting it as of yet. But there's different words in the Greek for seeing, so there's seeing with the eyes, which the Greek word is blepo, but there's also seeing as far as a witness, witnessing like a spectator. But that doesn't seem to get it as well. But there's also another word for seeing, which is in the Greek horao, which is to understand, to see and to understand. And what we find in Mark is that he uses these words in different kinds of ways, to talk about the fact that seeing with the eyes does not lead to believing. That there is something different when there is horao, seeing, that leads to understanding. But seeing with the eyes, just in that sense, blepo, seeing is not believing. So people will see Jesus' miracles. They will, like the disciples, will follow Jesus around, but that does not necessarily lead to believing. Later on in Mark's gospel, when Jesus is on the cross, there are the religious leaders who will be saying to Jesus, save yourself, and then we will see and believe. And it's interesting there that the word for see is horao. But the reality is that by that time in Mark's gospel, we all know that they won't. That the idea is that they will see with their eyes, that they would see with their eyes, and that they will somehow get it. And the idea is, well, no, you're not going to. But then you have in chapter 16 in Mark's gospel, when you have the young man who speaks to the women, and he says to them about going to Galilee, and there you will see him. And and the word there is horao. But with the idea that after the resurrection, after the death and resurrection of Jesus, that in seeing the resurrected Jesus, that then you will not just see him, but that you will get it.
Right.
And there's something powerful in the change in words, there, that it's not just seeing with the eyes, but but with the empty tomb and the raised Jesus, you now will get it, and this will all make sense.
Oh, wow.
And so seeing those differences, maybe using seeing there in the appropriate way,
Right.
really does make sense.
Yeah.
In terms of it's not just for Mark, the life of Jesus, but you have to see this whole story that culminates in the resurrected Jesus, which is why many people talk about this as an extended passion, that it culminates in in the death and resurrection of Jesus, and it's there that we really have the key for Mark's gospel, as many would say.
Oh, that is incredible! Wow, I really want to play with that theme Sunday morning about that view of right vision, because it's not just about seeing people. In Mark's passage, gosh, it was 3 weeks ago now that they saw him cast out demons. They saw it,
right,
that, and then they called him Lord of the Devil. It's like, or he's controlled by the devil. So it's not necessarily like it's a help to us, because we may want to see Jesus as the disciples saw him, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you'd believe any better than they did. Because they were behind the ball several times on who Jesus was. That is powerful.
Yeah.
Well, so to close our conversation out, how have you heard this passage preached best? What are some of the things that you felt like, if you've heard this passage preached, and I'm sure you have many times, what are some of the things that were conveyed well to have the congregation really understand and lock into this message here? Right.
Yeah. Well, I think one is the focus on the sense in which how this text exposes how we get locked in on our own expectations, versus how how Jesus is trying to, in many respects, expose the limitations of our own expectations, versus how the gospel unlocks what God wants in our lives. And so in the fact that it's talking about Nazarenes, for me as a Nazarene, that's always been easy to talk about how Nazarenes have been locked into their limited expectations too often. But so there's been that. The thing that's often stuck out has been again, verse 6, how Jesus was amazed at their unbelief. Religious these were, we need to be honest, these were good religious folk. And I mean, it's not like they were off doing their own thing on the Sabbath.
Right.
They were there to worship on the Sabbath, and so this powerful message about how what was exposed was what wasn't expected, was this this inherent disbelief that was at the center of their lives. And oftentimes at the center of our own lives, and yet what the gospel is calling for, is not only exposing that, but to redeem that. And I think that in our day and time, that can take an awful lot of many different shapes. But I think in proclaiming this text, I think that would require some exegesis of a congregation, perhaps, but but that could be, that's something that I've heard many times at that point.
Mm-hmm.
I think the kind of trust that Jesus calls for in the mission of the 12, that's very much related to that, is also connected to that, that kind of disbelief. I know for myself, how often I, all in the midst of my proclamation of trust and faith, this then turns around, and this gets turned around, and and this in essence calls me to re-examine, in terms of how much do I trust,
Mm-hmm.
because I leave awful lot of dust on my feet.
Right.
And it's almost like I want to hold on to it,
Yeah.
rather than leaving it, in that respect. And so so I haven't heard that proclaimed, perhaps, but that's causing me to think about the circumstances where I should have brushed the dust off and just simply gone on.
Mm-hmm.
I've instead harbored the dust. And maybe cherished it a bit, instead.
Man, I know that as an inherent worrywart and anxious person, I harbor dirt really, really well. I'm actually, it might be a spiritual gift of harboring dust, but it is difficult at times. It reminds me actually of Paul's language in Romans 12 when he said, "I wish for on the behalf of my Israelite brothers and sisters that I could be accursed and cut off from Christ." Because this broken relationship that he's having with many of his kin is just hurting and breaking his heart. And I don't think many people really see the shaking the dust off as that sort of, it's a lament to have to break relationship for the sake of the kingdom. It's not really, it's an act of self-sacrifice at times, because you saw the potential, you see great purpose in these people. It's not that they're inherently evil, but that they're not receptive to the faith that God has been proclaiming in their midst. And it may not be you that's able to give that to them. So moving along so that maybe someone else can come along and they will be receptive to their seed. Maybe the key there, but that's always been a hard thing for me personally, at least, for harboring that dirt, because I don't want to break relationship. So I'll hold on to the dirt rather than move on and go where I can grow and be planted.
Yeah, exactly.
Wow. Well, this has just been an incredible conversation. I always tell Danny I'm selfish because I feel like my sermons benefit from these conversations, and I'm hoping that it's a benefit to those who listen. Is there any final word you'd like to give us on this passage?
Yeah. Well, other than, I think, we've probably just scratched the surface. And so living in the text, is going to, to bring out so much more, for whoever's, for all those who listen and work with the text. So it's a fantastic 13 verses.
It really is, and such a fantastic commentary that you provided for us. We're just really thankful for your work and appreciate the way that you allow the Holy Spirit to work through you in your ministry and the position that you have. So thank you again for being my guest today.
Oh, enjoyed it so much, and quite frankly, I've been learning new things just in our conversation. Yeah, so that's what happens when we talk about Scripture, isn't it?
Amen. Amen. All right. Well, for those who are listening, please sign up for our newsletter. Be up to date on everything that's new happening. We're moving into a discipleship portion of the website where we're going to give resources that are crowdsourced from different pastors and professors in the Wesleyan world, so that we can give resources not only just for preaching but for discipleship as well. So keep an eye on that. Join the conversation, as I said before. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and we hope that this conversation, the resources that Plan Account provides, is a help to you in your service to your people. Go and preach boldly.
Thanks.